physician and director of the Boulder Abortion Clinic, and adjunct professor of anthropology at the University of Colorado. This evening, on this evening's Hemispheres, we're going to try a little bit of an experimental form, and we're going to begin the show this evening with a brief commentary by myself, Richard Curtis, your host this evening. After that, we'll go into a discussion of family planning issues with Dr. Hern.
Last week, Congress voted to release already budgeted funding for family planning services overseas. This funding was supposedly being held up because some people wanted to pull support from organizations that also provide abortions. What was unique last week was the intensity of the lobbying. Quote, "Buckets of cash are being poured in," unquote, Senator Patrick Leahy remarked. Why do you suppose so many people get so uptight about birth control? Some would say that the anti-choice, anti-family planning circles are just sexist, often in the extreme, hell-bent on taking us back to the good old days of the 1300s. Which may in fact be true, but how do those kind of deranged people manage to get buckets of cash? Are people with money just misogynists? Do they hate children? Maybe, but probably not. The really big bucks come out when rich people's profits are threatened. So if buckets of cash are opposing family planning measures in Congress, then family planning is probably a threat to profit somehow. But how? Well, if the issue is profit, then perhaps we should look to economics. If we step back from the issue of individual reproductive rights and look at the social effects of family planning, what do we find? Family planning is the control of rates of fertility. Fertility rates are one significant factor determining population. High fertility rates mean there are lots of people, lots of workers, and thus lower wages. So it would seem fairly obvious that if fertility is controlled all over the planet, we will have less people, less workers, and therefore higher wages, less profit. All of us who work for a living live in a global market for labor. If labor is really cheap in Mexico, for example, because there are so many people looking for work, then capitalists will locate factories there to take advantage of the higher profits, which result from lower labor costs. The further result being less jobs here, which then lowers labor costs because there are more workers competing for fewer jobs. In the end, family planning messes with the labor market all over the world and decreases profits. The ruling class would never admit this. No, they brought out some supposed experts to make a pretend moral argument before Congress. One Dr. Stephen Karanjan, an obstetrician from Kenya, said that family planning is, quote, "a comprehensive and highly organized campaign to kill off as many of our people as are necessary," unquote. Which just goes to show that the standards our Congress uses to decide issues is so low as to not even register in the realm of rational discourse. There's something deeply and profoundly wrong with our system of government. Do any of you actually believe that providing condoms and information about how to use them is part of a subversive plot to kill Africans? Do you believe that anyone who would believe such a thing is obviously and perhaps irretrievably insane? Yet this insanity is the level at which policy decisions are being discussed in our Congress. Of course, the real question is, do you believe that any of our congresspersons actually buy into the argument that distributing condoms is part of a plot to kill Africans? No, they may be obtuse, even foolish, but very few senators or representatives are actually insane. And there are even less of them now that Dornan was voted out. The reactionaries know what they're doing, but they do not necessarily want to talk about it in public. This is the reason people like Dr. Karanja are brought out to obscure the discussions. What would happen if Senator Trent Lott, for example, just admitted he didn't support family planning because it mucked up the free market and labor around the world? That's the kind of discussion people could really sink their teeth into, but Trent isn't going to say that. He'd never admit publicly that people starving is of no concern to the Republicans, because all they care about is the profits of their wealthy benefactors. There are important issues being decided by our government, great issues that will affect the lives of millions of people around the world. You just never would know it from the things they say in public. And in this case, we should probably hold Planned Parenthood partially responsible for failing to point out the obvious. The assault on family planning is more about labor costs than women's rights. In the words of Public Enemy,
Even had it on the news.
Don't believe the hype. Don't
And welcome, Dr. Hern.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, listeners may be familiar with your name because your practice is the Boulder Abortion Clinic.
Right.
And that's something that you've been doing for over 2 decades now.
Yeah, I started providing abortion services in Boulder in 1973 when I helped start Boulder Valley Clinic, which became Boulder Valley Women's Health Center. And I was the medical director there. I left there at the end of about a year and started my own practice, which is called Boulder Abortion Clinic. And so that opened in January of 1975. So that was 22 years ago. And so we're right at about, 23 and a half years that I've been doing this here in Boulder.
Quite a bit of experience. And you also have a background in epidemiology and teach anthropology.
That's right. My public health training is as a physician is in epidemiology. I have a couple of graduate degrees in that, and I am on the adjunct faculty at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Colorado, both in the University of Colorado Boulder and in Denver.
Now, we should probably mention to listeners that this week's Westward newspaper features an extensive and very interesting biography. So we were hoping this evening to focus a bit more on the issues behind family planning, such as I was raising earlier on the tape. And also we wanted to touch on some of the local issues here in Colorado. We've recently seen a very onerous anti-abortion bill sent off to its death in the Finance Committee of the Senate, I believe. That was the anticipation, anyway, that the committee would kill it. And you were involved in testifying.
I testified against 2 bills that were before the state legislature. The first one was called, its official title was the Partial Birth Abortion Bill, which I call the Partial Truth Abortion Bill, because the authors, of course, cared nothing about the truth whatsoever. There is no such thing in the medical literature as partial birth abortion. This is a political term. It doesn't exist in the medical literature, and there's nothing like this is performed in Colorado. I don't perform it, but the anti-abortion fanatics in the legislature offered this bill that was principally symbolic as a way of organizing their radical anti-abortion supporters, and the objective of this was completely political, had nothing to do with medicine, logic, facts, reality, or anything else. It had to do with power. And so I went down to testify against this bill, and I was treated like a common criminal by the State Affairs Committee. Obviously, here's a bill to restrict a particular kind of surgical procedure, which no one does, of course. And being a medical procedure, it obviously should go to the State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee. That's the logical place for that to go. And it went there, and the Mike Salas is the representative. Mike Salas, the chair of the committee. The committee is dominated by anti-abortion fanatics who put me under oath and treated me, interrogated me as though I were a criminal. Tried to make me take an oath, that said, I swear to the everlasting God and all that sort of thing, which I refused to do. But that bill, in fact, was passed out of that committee that day, and on Friday, I believe, it was then sent to the Judiciary Committee of the House because the antics of the anti-abortion fanatics on that State Affairs Committee were so embarrassing to the Republican leadership, which basically agreed with them, but they were so obviously rough and uncivilized that the Republican leadership was found it embarrassing and said that we're going to try to stop this now, and so they sent it to Judiciary, where it died. Then there was another bill called the Regulation of Post-Viability Abortions bill, so-called HB 1150, which purported to to regulate late abortions, and the basic premises of both of these bills, of course, were absolutely false. They had no basis in fact whatsoever. Didn't bother the sponsors. I went and testified against that bill on the 4th of February, and I was treated the same way. But in this particular instance, and by the way, I was accompanied to in my opposition to both of these bills by a number of other people who were representatives of medical societies, Colorado GYNOB Society, Planned Parenthood, National Abortion Rights Action League, and various other individuals. And so the concerted effort resulted in the defeat in the committee of the second bill, which was, by the way, specifically directed at my medical practice. I'm the only physician in the state who, at least publicly, does late abortions after the second trimester of pregnancy.
It appeared to me that with the change in presidency from Republicans to Democrat with Bill Clinton, that executive level support for these kinds of harassing legislative measures in the country at large was going to be cut off at the knees. And it seems like the anti-abortion movement did quiet down a little bit for a while, but things are certainly much more visible again.
Well, I'm afraid that impression, while it is there's some evidence for it, is probably not correct, I would say, because it is true that President Clinton did a number of important things to support reproductive freedom, and even in his first days of office. And he has provided some effective leadership on that issue. On the other hand, in the first place, the Republicans took over Congress in 1994, and immediately, and with the extraordinary help and effective help of the anti-abortion movement, there's a specific example. Phil Gramm from Texas was the senator in charge of the senatorial campaign Republican campaign fund committee, campaign committee for the United States Senate. And since he had maxed out with his contributions to his Republican candidates from that particular campaign committee, he gave something like $250,000 to the National Right to Life Committee the week before the 1994 election, and which was then directed into anti-abortion ads against Democratic candidates, and all of those Republican candidates for the United States Senate won, not a coincidence. And then the following summer, the Republican leaders in the both houses of Congress announced that it was payback time. And I think in the House of Representatives alone, there were something like 10 bills introduced in 1 month that were opposed to abortion rights, reproductive freedom, and other things that seriously affected the welfare of women. And so there's a very strong linkage between the Republican Party and the anti-abortion movement, and has been for about 20 years. And the Congress was very active in passing then very damaging anti-abortion legislation and cutting the funding for women and children and other constituencies that were not powerful enough to keep that from happening. There are a lot of Republican governors, I don't know how many, but the Republicans control the Colorado legislature, and as long as the Republican Party at this point is basically controlled by the radical anti-abortion Christian fundamentalist movement, and Ralph Reed is the perfect example of that. And so that the moderate, progressive Republicans, of which there are some, and pro-choice Republicans are out, and they have no influence in the party. And so therefore, as long as the current leadership of the Republican Party is in charge of anything in this country, there is no hope for reproductive freedom in this country.
You said earlier in regards to the specific bills in Colorado that the issue wasn't medicine, that the issue was power.
That's right. Now these bills had to do with, for example, the first bill, the most hideous one of them, which is sort of political pornography in the anti-abortion realm, was passed on the anniversary of Roe versus Wade, and there was a very important symbolic victory for the anti-abortion people in the legislature. And they had maximum publicity. Stories about this were on the front page of all the papers, and they dominated the news, and they have successfully defined reality their way, so that the press, for example, was reporting that the legislature was preparing to outlaw partial birth abortions with the open premise that there is such a thing. There isn't. And these people in the legislature basically had the attitude, we have complete power, we have the majority here, we can do anything we want. We can define up as down, black as white, the earth is flat, the moon is made of cheese, and you can't do anything about it. And the facts that you bring to us as a physician and a scientist are irrelevant. We don't care what they are.
Why do you suppose these people are so concerned about this particular issue?
Because it's very effective in organizing their radical supporters at election time. They win elections this way. This is how they get power. The radical political right decided a long time ago, in the mid-'70s, that they wanted to own the abortion issue, and they have. And they have then mobilized the cultural conservatives, the middle class, the lower middle class, or whatever, working class people out there with limited education who are very frightened about the changing nature of our society, the changing roles of women, the changing values, and who have a great deal invested in a patriarchal society. There are women out there who are frightened of freedom, who support this movement. And those people then are mobilized by the radical political right to help them at election time by whipping them up into a frenzy about the abortion issue. And they're already concerned about it. And abortion becomes a symbol of social change. Abortion becomes a symbol of freedom for women. And freedom to do what? Freedom to compete with men for jobs and money and power. Freedom to be full first-class citizens in our society. There are a lot of people out there who do not want women to be first-class citizens in our society. They're not right now. If they were, this would not be an issue. But I think that, for example, Bob Dole in 1974 was very far behind in his race for re-election to the United States Senate in a race with Dr. Roy, who was an obstetrician gynecologist from Topeka. Dr. Roy had delivered thousands of babies and had maybe done 5 or 6 abortions. Dole was behind maybe, 10 or 15 or 20 points, something like that, a long ways. He started attacking Dr. Roy on the abortion issue, calling him an abortionist, and it was a McCarthyist kind of tactic, and Dole won. And that was one of the first instances where the abortion issue was used to great effect by a Republican candidate. They came along then and used it in 1980 to help them capture control of the United States Senate. It helped elect Ronald Reagan. It has helped Jesse Helms a great deal. It helped elect George Bush. And it helped very much elect the Republican control of Congress in 1994.
Your analysis would suggest that the vast majority of voters who are supporting this, or at least a good deal of them, aren't necessarily preoccupied with the issue, but somehow it appeals to them on an emotional level.
Well, if you go out and do polls in the public and you sort of ask them in general, should abortion be legal, they say yes to the tune of 75 or 80%. When you start asking about specific incidents, specific kinds of circumstances, they become more conservative. So in general, the American public supports reproductive freedom, but it doesn't matter what they think because they don't vote. And most people don't vote. And I think that we've had in the last presidential election, I think one of the lowest turnouts we've ever had. We have the lowest portion of eligible people voting, I think, in any industrial country, a Western democracy. And there may be others that are worse than we are, but I don't know who they are. But in any case, the anti-abortion fanatics are extremely motivated and do vote on the basis of that issue alone. And they go out and they organize the hell out of their supporters, and they go to the churches and they bring a religious fervor to this, and they win elections regularly. There's an article in the Camera today, which I haven't finished reading, but there's something to the effect of the 5 county chairs of the Republican Party and along the Front Range are now known to be very strong anti-abortion fanatics, and that is the main issue that they go on. This is an organizing issue for the Republicans, and what you have is that the anti-abortion movement is the engine of fascism in this country. This is a fascist movement, and it's violent, and it's totalitarian, it's highly authoritarian, and these people want a fascist theocracy, which they intend to get. And the right of reproductive freedom will be one of the least significant freedoms that they take away from us when they have complete power.
You've written about an experience that you had traveling in East Germany, what was then East Germany, and seeing one of the synagogues that had been firebombed during Kristallnacht. That made quite an impression on you. The analogy you're drawing is clear, obviously.
Well, I have followed right-wing movements since I was in college. I was in a political science class up at CU, and one of my assignments was to write about one of these things, and I saw an ad about this in the paper, and one of my buddies and I went down to attend a right-wing religious rally in Denver that was very sympathetic to the House Un-American Activities Committee, and there was a kind of a revival meeting, and it was strongly pervaded with anti-communist hysteria and so forth and so on. Well, you know, so I wrote about this, and I've followed the information about these kind of movements ever since. And you know, one of the things that did happen, referring to the event in Germany, was that I had been under pressure by the anti-abortion people for some time, and I had met a fellow named Joseph Scheidler at a meeting in California in 1984 when he towered over me and said, you know, with his icy blue eyes and his intimidating manner, that he was going to come to Boulder and close my office. And it was apparent to me that he was quite serious. And here was a guy who looked like a Nazi, thinks like a Nazi, walks like a Nazi, talks like a Nazi, and he's not a duck. And he told me he was going to come to Boulder to shut down my office. And you know, if a guy like that says he's going to come all the way from Chicago to keep me from doing what I'm doing, then I must be doing something very important for the cause of human freedom. And then that fall in '85, then the anti-abortion people had picked up the activity toward me, against me anyway, and so I had that in mind as I went to Europe, and I was speaking at a medical meeting, and one of my colleagues and his wife and I went over to East Germany and to East Berlin, and we did see the Jewish synagogue that had been burned on the night of Kristallnacht, and the Jewish Community Center, and the flame marks were still there. It was a very moving experience for me to see that. I felt very overwhelmed by the moment, and thinking that here is one of the places where this Nazi movement started, that was such a catastrophic experience for the human species, particularly the 6 million Jews and other people who were killed in the Holocaust, and that this is where it started, and this is one of the places where that began to manifest itself in Europe. Certainly not necessarily the first place, but one of the important places. And it was only about a couple of weeks later that Scheidler came then to Boulder with a specific intent of harassing me and closing my office. And he has a book called "Close 99 Ways to Close Abortion Clinics," and he basically says, if we can't make abortion illegal, we'll make it impossible. And so he came there, and then I was attending a meeting in Seattle, and my administrator was sitting in the front office taking phone calls from patients and making appointments, and a stone came through the front window. And I was at this meeting, and she called me and told me about it. She was very frightened, and I flew back from Seattle to see what was happening, because I found it a very ominous thing to happen, a very ominous event. And I saw the window. It was broken. There was plywood over it, and they were supposed to come fix the glass on that Monday, and Scheidler was going to be there all that week and having demonstrations against me and having press conferences and stuff. And I woke up thinking, I'm not going to have them fix that window. I want people to see what has happened here, what it means. And I was thinking about Kristallnacht. This is obviously a very, very small incident, you know, on the scale of history and all that stuff. And it is trivial compared to obviously what happened in Berlin, but it's the same idea. And
Rocks through windows.
and the person who did it was one of Scheidler's followers. And so I went to my little workshop and I got some mat board from my photography bench, and I hand-lettered a sign that said, this window was broken by those who hate freedom. And I put it up there. And so that was at Scheidler's back when they were doing the press conferences. And I felt that that was a statement, in my opinion, of what had happened.
And it would seem the analogy, the parallel that you draw with the Nazi movement in Germany does ring a certain truth here, because Jews were less powerful in that society, and women are less powerful in our society. So the first line of attack is against the less powerful.
For one thing, you know, the Nazis singled out the Jews as scapegoats and marginalized them. They tried to they started taking away their rights. And, you know, we're going to treat you in a different way, and you can't teach now, and you can't have a business, and you can't go to school, and you can't do this, and then the other thing. And pretty soon, the Jews had no rights at all. And the Nazis very effectively used the Jews as scapegoats and as a way of focusing the anger of the German public on the Jews, and as a way of getting power. That's what they did. And that was one of the reasons for, you know, what they did to the Jews, and to say nothing of the basic anti-Semitism and hatred of the Jews, and which had obviously roots in European history going back centuries. But you know, the fascists in Italy did the same kind of a thing. They might have picked them out some other groups, but you know, the Italian fascists, of course, and the Nazis very much restricted the freedom of women. And the Nazis said, if you're an Aryan woman, so-called, then you must breed, you must have children for the Third Reich, and if you're not an Aryan woman, if you're a gypsy or you're a Jew, then you have to have abortion. I mean, they basically said, we're going to control your reproductive system. And this is, of course, what Ceausescu did in Romania when he was in power. He basically said, you know, women are reproductive machines and have to produce babies for this totalitarian state, and that he had pregnancy police, and abortion was illegal, and a lot of women died as a result of that. But so there are many examples in history, and even certainly in this century, where totalitarian states have attacked specific groups and attacked the rights of women as a way of getting power and exploiting, women in that way. So the parallels are there, and I think that it is not an exaggeration, as far as I'm concerned, that we have a very serious fascist movement in this country, and it's called the anti-abortion movement.
We should probably take just a brief moment here to director of the Boulder Abortion Clinic and adjunct professor of anthropology. Dr. Hern, one of the things you said earlier was that the changing gender roles are seen as sort of enigmatic of changes in society, that people are feeling a little out of control, and so focusing on controlling women, controlling their reproduction, is a way of trying to control the world around us, to seem a little less out of control anyway.
That's right. This problem, this controversy is happening at several levels, one of which, as you identify, people who are, you might call them the cultural conservatives, in the sense that they are frightened by social change, they are frightened by the role of women, they are frightened by the independence that women have as a result of not having to reproduce. that giving women choices about reproduction is very threatening, because it means that women are no longer under the control of men, that they can decide what to do with their lives, with their bodies, and they can be full persons in the fullest sense, and that they can decide whether to reproduce. They can decide whether they're going to spend their time being an artist or an engineer or a lawyer or a journalist or whatever they decide to do, and simply not be a reproductive machine. They can also choose to reproduce if they wish to do so, and they want to have that constellation of relationships in their lives. And that freedom is very frightening to a lot of people, and including some women. To me, the most frightening and disturbing thing about this is the extent and energy to which the radical political right in this country, which doesn't really care anything about abortion as far as I'm concerned, as far as I can see, has decided to exploit the abortion issue to get power, and they have been extremely effective at doing this.
Well, to get back a little bit to the bigger issues that I started the show with, the standard analysis of fascism as a political movement is that it's a response of the capitalist ruling class to crisis, a way of controlling an economy that is slipping away from their control.
Well, that's, that is true, and I think that if you look at this a little bit, there are some parallel strains here. Well, one is I don't know exactly what it's called. I think it's called Christian Reconstruction or something like that. That's a Christian movement, that's a fundamentalist movement that basically wants a theocracy. And they hate secular society. They hate the Constitution. They hate constitutional freedoms. And the anti-abortion movement has a lot of people like that in it. And so they want power for its own sake, in the sense of controlling society and control, as well as just controlling women. So there are basic issues of freedom involved there. These people don't want you to learn about evolution, for example, when you study biology. They want you to learn, creation science, so-called, which is a complete oxymoron. It's not scientific. And then you have, again, the radical political right, which is exploiting the abortion issue. Now, you can go to a book like Politics of the Rich and Poor by Kevin Phillips, who is not by any means any wild-eyed liberal. He's a Republican apologist. This is a guy who worked for Richard Nixon and who's a Republican, who writes a very conservative theme. And in the Politics of the Rich and Poor, he acknowledges the fact that the principal purpose of the Reagan and Bush administrations were to move money and resources from the poor to the rich. And they did. And that the abortion issue was one of the issues they used to get the power so they could do that.
Which is ironic, because the people who would be victimized by losing their resources, the poor, are some of the very people who are drawn upon to support the right.
They don't care about that. Yeah, they don't care about. And then you in your commentary, you're talking about the whole business of capitalist exploitation of poor people. Well, if you have a policy that says we're going to restrict your access to fertility control so that you reproduce as much as possible, you have a lot of poor people running around without jobs. You have cheap labor, and that is very beneficial for capitalist enterprises that exploit cheap labor. And it's very effective. And if you can have cheap labor, you can produce goods at a very low rate, and you can make extremely nice profits.
Now, why is it that we don't hear a lot of that kind of talk from organizations like Planned Parenthood?
Because it's too radical and it's frightening. People don't want to look at that. They need support from their Republican donors who would like to feel good about giving money to an organization that supports a social cause that they believe in, and in fact, organizations like Planned Parenthood do a very effective work in providing fertility control for people, and in fact, in fighting the kind of extremely conservative legislation that is very much opposed to women, as we've seen in the Colorado legislature. But, the mainstream organizations like that cannot alienate their more conservative supporters
Their money
by
sources.
talking about that.
Are they going to have to? I mean, if
Well,
the progression...
I think that there's a role for everybody here. I mean, I'm okay with organizations like Planned Parenthood focusing on the rights of women and bringing information out and supporting, and National Abortion Rights Action League, for example, supporting pro-choice candidates and on both sides of the aisle and that sort of thing. That's fine. I also think there's a role for those who want to point out the really ugly and extremely uncomfortable aspects of what these policies mean that we're attacking. And I think that the fact is that it doesn't make any sense for the fiscal conservatives to oppose family planning, birth control, abortion, all that stuff, which allows people to control their fertility in a fiscal sense, because the cost to society of people having children that they can't afford to take care of people having sick kids, and of being sick when they're having pregnancies that are very dangerous, and having a lot of people on welfare is all obviously crazy social policy. But then you have to look at, well, what are they getting out of it, And one of the things that they're getting out of it is power. They win elections by being against abortion, which is sort of like being for motherhood and apple pie, and against sin. And also, you can't ignore the fact that the consequences of the policies of withholding federal aid to family planning, either here and abroad, results in very large increases in populations of people who are poor and who are easy to exploit. And that's a very uncomfortable fact that most people don't want to deal with.
It appears in our society today that the costs of that are being borne by the poor and by working people through their taxes.
The poor in just about any place you want to look, whether you're talking about places in this country or you're talking about overseas, are horribly exploited and suffer almost incomprehensibly because of these kinds of conditions where the fertility is high and there's no place for people to go, there's no housing, there's no education, there's no jobs, there's no sanitation, there's no food, etc. And then you have somebody like the Pope who shows up in these desperately poor places where people are stripping the landscape bare in their attempt to feed themselves and tell them to reproduce as much as possible. It is absolute madness. But, the American government had the same policy for quite a long time under Reagan and Bush. The Clinton administration had tried to have some very progressive and humane policies concerning fertility control in the first 2 years. But then the Republicans took over and said, no, you're not going to do that. And only recently did they restore some of the money they put back in family planning. But the levels of family planning money for this country was very seriously diminished from like $580 million a year to maybe $72 million by the Republicans. And that is because the anti-abortion fanatics control the Republican Party and control Congress.
And if these larger economic factors that are causing people to feel so disturbed, the massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, if that is continuing and perhaps even accelerating in our own time, then I have to come back to my question about Planned Parenthood. Won't it someday be necessary for them to adopt a more clear and comprehensive analysis of the problem in order to confront this danger of fascism?
Well, I can't speak for Planned Parenthood. I don't have any official connection with Planned Parenthood. I sure have a lot of friends and colleagues who work with Planned Parenthood, and I work with Planned Parenthood and I applaud their efforts. I have nothing bad to say about Planned Parenthood and everything good to say about it. I think Planned Parenthood
Well, maybe we should
has
divorce the
well,
issue
well,
from Planned Parenthood per
the
se.
Planned Parenthood and other organizations like that have a certain role in the middle of trying to support positive programs, which they do, and to oppose the most egregious legislation, which they do, and very effectively. And so that's fine. I think that, you know, again, I can't speak for them, but for them to go out and talk about some of the more global consequences of the bad policies that are opposed to reproductive freedom and limiting access to fertility control is not politically useful for them. And it doesn't seem to me that it's productive for them. That they would lose a lot of their mainstream support that in fact helps make them very effective. Again, this is something for those people to answer, not for me to talk about. You know.
I understand.
Yeah,
I understand.
I can't
But
speak for
do you have the impression that these problems are going to get worse? That we're going to see
the
more and
problems
more?
are getting worse as we speak. I mean, let's take some examples from abroad. Okay. Rwanda has had the highest fertility rate and population growth rate in Africa. The population growth rate was approximately 3.8% per year up until a few years ago when the society collapsed.
And what is the rate here, just for comparison?
What?
In the United States?
It's about 1% a year.
Okay.
Okay, but
So it's
but the point is
significantly greater.
In Africa, Rwanda had the highest population growth rate on the continent. There were some others pretty close, but it's 3.8% per year, which means population is doubling like every 17 years or something like that. There was absolutely no place for those people to go. Now you have the spectacle in Central Africa and in East Africa and Rwanda, Burundi, and other places of whole societies collapsing and dissolving into chaos and butchery. That's the future, and it's not just the future; it's happening right now. And Rwanda is a place where the Catholic Church had its own way. It had all of its policies were in effect everybody's opposed to birth control, all the rest of it. Now, you know, the lesson is obvious. The population growth was out of control, and there was no way for the society to integrate the number of people who were coming into society each year and who needed education, jobs, clothing, food, all the rest. Impossible. Impossible. And if you look in this hemisphere, the country with the highest population growth rate has been Haiti, with a population growth rate of 3.8% per year. And that island and that country has been stripped bare. And the society collapsed. Now, it's doing better now, but has a lot of help. But my point is that those are unsustainable situations, absolutely unsustainable. And there are many, many situations like that all over the world. And the policies of the American government, which in the past have openly opposed the availability of fertility control under Reagan and Bush, are completely madness, completely counterproductive, and the results of those policies are unspeakable misery for the people in those countries and for many other people.
Where would you suggest we should go from here? Suggest to listeners.
If there are people who are concerned about freedom in this country and who want to have rational social policies, they need to support pro-choice candidates for public office in both parties. And right now, the radical Christian fundamentalist anti-abortion fanatics are controlling the Republican Party. And if someone is a Republican and they don't like that, they should go out and take the party away from those people and put the intelligent, reasonable people back in charge of that party. And they used to be. The Republican Party has had a long history of supporting reproductive freedom and environmental conservation and some very good things. And, you know, reasonable people can disagree about economic policies, etc., but we're not dealing now with reasonable people in charge of the Republican Party. The reasonable people in the Republican Party are out of control They're out of power. They do not have any influence in that party. And a lot of the liberals, the Democrats and others who wring their hands about this problem, don't care enough to go out and win elections. They just don't take it that seriously. You know, I got a call from some woman up in Minnesota or something like that who wanted to do some kind of a clinic defense deal where, you know, the pro-choice people would surround the clinic and they would prevent, you know, the demonstrators from coming. I said, well, you become part of the problem when you do that. You know, when you have anti-abortion
Adding
protesters.
to the spectacle?
Pardon me?
Adding to the spectacle?
Adding to the spectacle, adding confusion, adding pain for the patient, adding confusion for the police. I mean, that's not an appropriate activity. A political demonstration is not an appropriate activity there. If the anti-abortion people do it, then that's one thing, and that they should be dealt with in a straightforward manner, you know, and when they try to disrupt the activities, they should be taken away, because that's illegal. It's unconstitutional. But, you know, trying to do it exactly the same thing is not helpful. So I said, you know, why don't you try, you know, winning elections for a change, you know, so that the people who control power, who have the power and control the government, are on our side. Oh, well, then you would just be part of the same part of the problem. I mean, I don't have anything to do with politics, and I don't vote or do anything like that. I said, well, you know, then you have to accept the situation you get, because if you don't vote and you're not active politically, then you have to accept the result, and what you think doesn't matter. And so I'm afraid there are a lot of people who don't understand that the best thing about democracy is that it works. The worst thing about democracy is that it works. If you vote for fascism, you get fascism. And in the pre-feminist time of 1789, I'm trying to think the name of it's escaping me right now. I can't believe I can't think of this, but the man said, Edmund Burke said, that the only thing that is required for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And he said this in the British Parliament, and they were discussing colonial policy. But that is a very important political statement, and people need to understand that. And that if they don't like, you know, some of the fascist bullies in the Colorado legislature, they need to go and see that those guys don't get elected precinct captain next time, or that at least the people who win elections in other districts are pro-choice and outnumber them. And then stuff like this can't happen.
Yeah, that quote from Burke seems particularly apropos. As you were pointing out, if Americans are saying that they're pro-choice, 75, 80% of the population, but yet those aren't the people being elected because half of the population isn't bothering to vote, then there is the evil.
Well, the problem is that, you know, that the people who hate freedom in this country care a lot more about getting power and using it than the people who say that they believe in freedom. And the Constitution says right there that if you win an election, you have power. And, you know, if you don't run for office, you have a 100% chance of not winning the election, as Tim Worth says. You know, and if you don't, you know, get elected and you don't, you know, take the power, then you have a 100% chance of not being able to exercise power. And it's very simple.
That example of the woman from up north wanting to distance herself from politics because it's dirty, is that the kind of thing you run into a lot?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that all across the country you find people who, you know, they're totally cynical about politics and say, well, I don't want to have anything to do with politics. I won't go to a precinct caucus meeting. I won't go to a party meeting. I won't work for somebody's election. I won't do this. Well, then they're out. They don't have any voice whatsoever. And they don't really have any reason to complain about what they get. I think that Boulder is an unusually sophisticated city in the sense that an awful lot of people are very deeply involved in politics here and really are very active, and they go out and they work hard, you know, to win elections and work hard for their candidates, and they take it quite seriously. I think it's great. I think that there are times when I wish that more people around the state were more involved and were as enlightened as a lot of the people in Boulder. But, you know, you get some, you know, hot spots of thought, you know, once in a while, and it works.
In our last few minutes, perhaps we could move to a little bit of a little different subject. I believe you've spoken in the past about the global danger of not controlling population and the effects that could have on on all of us in the planet and using up resources and such. Is that ringing a bell?
Well, I think that it's obvious to me that the human species is now in the process of converting all organic, inorganic, plant, animal matter on the planet to human tissue, to human population, and we are devouring the planet, and we are converting everything we can find into human beings, and converting the environment into a human manufactured environment, and the natural environment is under great pressure and is being destroyed at a breathtaking rate. And the engine behind this destruction is the uncontrolled growth of the human population, which has gone on for a long, long time. And we are just seeing the most recent manifestations of that. This process really took a tremendous jump and began having a great momentum at the beginning of the Neolithic, after agriculture was invented, some 10 or 12,000 years ago. And the population of the human species has doubled many times, and in fact the doubling time has diminished by 50% with each doubling over the last several thousand years. And so we are now faced with some absolutely catastrophic situations across the world, around the world, that are for which we're not prepared. The human species has never experienced anything like this before, and we don't know what to do about it.
And you've compared that process with cancer.
That's my diagnosis. It's not an analogy, it's a diagnosis.
Diagnosis.
What I've said is that the human species now has all the major characteristics of a malignant process. There are several major characteristics of a malignant process, and the human species has all of them, and spades. And I think that in an organismic pathology, you only need 2 of these diagnostic criteria to form a diagnosis of malignant process. You only need 2 of the 4. If you have 2, it's a malignant process, a cancer, and to prove it otherwise. We have all 4 of these characteristics, and there are a lot of other things that sort of ancillary aspects of this that go with it.
And what are those for?
Well, the principal characteristics in a malignant process in an organism are rapid, uncontrolled growth, invasion and destruction of adjacent normal tissues, metastasis or distant colonization of the cancer cells, and dedifferentiation, which means loss of the distinctive features of the individual cells or tissues. Now, when you translate this into the superorganic phenomenon of the human species, then what you have is the phenomenon of rapid, uncontrolled growth of the human population, which is quite obvious, which has gone on for thousands of years and will continue to go on. And the second is invasion and destruction of adjacent ecosystems, of all ecosystems, and so forth. I think you need to stop. The third thing is metastasis. In this case, in our case, is distant colonization, which the human species has been doing from its origins,
spreading out
and establishing colonies all over the planet. The fourth thing is dedifferentiation, which needs a little bit of translation, but basically we're the same organism all over the planet. But I think that try to specifically look at some things about this. One of the ways in which we are undifferentiated exploiters of all ecosystems is that we have cultural adaptations that allow us to overcome our physiologic and evolutionary limitations as organisms and allow us to exploit all ecosystems. So that is there are other aspects of that we can talk about, but that's one of the ways in which you get at this idea of dedifferentiation. Now, the thing is that we have 4 of these characteristics. If we're going to, the difference between us and a cancer is we can think and we can decide not to be a cancer. Okay?
We could have family planning.
Yes, we could limit our fertility. And some people want to, and some people don't. But for us to stop being a cancer, we have to take away at least 3 of those characteristics. So that, in other words, if population growth stopped dead cold today, which it won't, that doesn't change the diagnosis. And so if we stop destroying the environment, but population continue to grow, obviously that doesn't change the diagnosis. So that there are, it's a very it's really not so complicated, but you know, the policies involved in getting those things to happen are complicated, and the politics are impossible. And I think that so I started developing this idea about 25 or 30 years ago, and I published some things about it in 1990 and 92 and so forth. But I think that it's a diagnosis. It's not an analogy. You don't die from an analogy. You go to the doctor's office and the doctor says, that black thing on your forehead is a malignant melanoma. Not to worry, it's just a metaphor. The doctor would not say that. And if the doctor did, this malignant melanoma would kill you, and the doctor would probably lose his license. But so you don't die from an analogy, but you do die from a diagnosis of a malignant process.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. It appears we're out of time. You've been listening to Hemispheres here on KGNU Boulder. My name is Richard Curtis. I've been your host this evening, and we've been speaking with Dr. Warren Hern, obstetrician and director of, gynecologist.
I'm an epidemiologist.
Okay. And director of the Boulder Abortion Clinic. Thank you very much. Coming up next, we have Cordiente.